The 5 most feared warriors in the Bible. Picture this. You're standing on the battlefield, heart pounding. The ground trembles beneath your feet. A single warrior steps forward. His presence alone strikes fear into the hearts of thousands. His enemies whisper his name in terror. He isn't just strong, he's unstoppable. Now imagine there are 5 of these warriors. These were men who didn't just fight battles, they dominated them. They weren't just soldiers, they were legends. Kings, armies, and entire nations feared them, not because of their weapons, but because of who fought for them. Some of them faced giants. Some led unbeatable armies. Some fought alone and still won. What made these warriors so terrifying? Was it their strength, their skill, or was it something far greater? In this video, we'll dive into the lives of 5 of the most feared warriors in the Bible. These men weren't just fighters, they were chosen by God, and today, their stories still shake the world. Stay with me till the end, because what you're about to hear will not only inspire you, but it might just change the way you see strength, faith, and the battles you face in your own life. Let's begin. 1. David, the giant slayer. King of war. Let's talk about a warrior whose name still echoes through history. A shepherd boy who became a king, a man after God's own heart, and a warrior feared by nations. His name? David. But before he was a king, before he was a legend, he was just a young boy standing face to face with a giant. The battle that changed everything. The Philistine army was ready for war, but instead of sending an army, they sent a monster, a 9-foot-tall giant named Goliath. His armor was impenetrable, his sword massive, and his voice alone sent chills down the spines of Israel's best warriors. For 40 days, Goliath mocked Israel. No one dared to step forward. Not Saul, not Israel's best fighters. Fear paralyzed them. And then, a shepherd boy arrived. David didn't come to fight. He was just delivering food to his brothers. But when he heard Goliath mocking God, something inside him ignited. While grown men cowered, David stepped forward. Not with a sword, not with armor, but with faith. He walked onto that battlefield with nothing but a sling, 5 smooth stones, and the name of the Lord. Goliath laughed. David ran toward him, slung a single stone, and in an instant, Goliath was dead. One shot, one moment, a boy took down a giant and changed history. Why was David feared? That wasn't David's last battle. No, it was just the beginning. He became a warrior so feared that even his own king turned against him. He killed tens of thousands in battle. 1 Samuel 18:7. He never lost a war. Every army he faced, he conquered. He had the loyalty of the fiercest warriors, the mighty men who were willing to die for him. David didn't just fight with weapons, he fought with wisdom, strategy, and faith. He was a man who knew when to strike, when to wait, and when to trust God to fight for him. Even in exile, even when hunted, he could not be stopped. Lessons from David. What can we learn from him? Courage isn't about size, it's about faith. The difference between David and the men who feared Goliath was simple. David trusted God. Preparation matters. David had been practicing with his sling for years. He wasn't just lucky, he was ready. Victory belongs to those who trust in God, not just in weapons. David was not just a king. He was a warrior, anointed by God, and that made him unstoppable. 2. Samson, the unstoppable juggernaut. If David was a master strategist, then Samson was a wrecking ball. He didn't need an army. He didn't need a sword. He was the weapon. Picture this. One man standing alone, 1,000 soldiers rushing toward him. and in his hand, the jawbone of a donkey. One by one they fall. 100, 200, 500. The battlefield is drenched in chaos. By the time it's over, 1,000 men lay dead. Samson was not just feared, he was a nightmare for the Philistines. The source of his strength. Samson wasn't just strong. He was superhuman. His power didn't come from training. It didn't come from armor. It came from a covenant with God. From birth, he was chosen, a Nazirite, set apart. His hair was never to be cut, because it was the sign of his vow to God. As long as that vow remained unbroken, he was unstoppable. He killed a lion with his bare hands. He ripped apart city gates and carried them up a mountain. He wiped out armies alone. But Samson's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. Why was Samson feared? The Philistines tried everything to stop him, but nothing worked. They sent armies. He destroyed them. They locked him in chains. He broke free. They trapped him inside a city. He carried its gates away. He was more than a warrior. He was an unbreakable force. Until he broke his own vow. Delilah, the woman who betrayed him, convinced him to reveal his secret. When his hair was cut, his strength left him. Captured, blinded, chained. The mighty Samson, once the terror of the Philistines, was humiliated in their temple. But they forgot something. His strength was never about his hair. It was about his relationship with God. And in his final moment, he prayed. His hair began to grow. His strength returned. And in one last act, he pulled down the entire Philistine temple, killing more enemies in death than he ever did in life. Lessons from Samson. What does Samson teach us? Your greatest strength can become your greatest weakness if you don't guard it. Power without discipline leads to downfall. Samson was strong, but he lacked self-control. Even in failure, God's mercy is greater. In his last moment, God restored him. Samson was feared because he was an unstoppable force. But his story is also a warning. Even the strongest fall when they stop relying on God. But when they return, God is ready to restore them. If you think David and Samson were terrifying, just wait. Because the next warriors didn't just win battles, they conquered nations. Let's keep going. 3. Joshua, the conqueror of Canaan. If David was the master strategist and Samson was the unstoppable force, Joshua was the fearless conqueror. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a leader of armies, a man who led God's people into victory after victory. When Moses died, the responsibility of leading the Israelites into the promised land fell on Joshua's shoulders, and he wasn't about to back down. The Battle of Jericho, a miracle in warfare. Imagine standing before one of the most fortified cities in history. Thick, towering walls. A powerful army inside. A city that had never been conquered. Joshua didn't have siege weapons. He didn't have battering rams. He had a command from God. March around the city for 7 days. Say nothing. On the 7th day, shout. It sounded insane. It sounded impossible. But when Joshua obeyed, the walls of Jericho crumbled into dust. The mighty city was reduced to rubble, and Israel took it without even drawing a sword. That was just the beginning. Why was Joshua feared? Joshua wasn't just another leader. He was a warrior led by God himself. He led Israel to 31 victorious battles. Joshua 12:24. He defeated entire kingdoms. He was so powerful that other kings formed alliances just to try to stop him. But his greatest moment? A battle that defied time itself. The battle where the sun stood still. Joshua was deep in battle against the Amorites. The enemy was retreating, but the sun was setting. If darkness fell, the enemy would escape. Joshua prayed the impossible. "Sun, stand still." And it did. For an entire day, the sun stayed in the sky, giving Joshua the time he needed to crush his enemies completely. This was not just military strategy. This was a warrior so in sync with God that even the heavens obeyed his command. Lessons from Joshua. Obedience brings victory. The walls of Jericho fell not by force, but by faith. Bold prayers lead to bold victories. Joshua prayed for the sun to stop, and it did. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward anyway. God told Joshua 3 times, "Be strong and courageous." Joshua wasn't just a warrior. He was a conqueror anointed by God. And his enemies, they didn't just fear him, they feared the God who fought for him. 4. Joab, the shadow general. Now let's talk about a warrior who didn't just fight battles, he commanded them. You might not hear his name preached often, but in the world of warfare, Joab was a nightmare. Joab wasn't a king, he wasn't a prophet. He was the man behind David's greatest military victories. If David was the heart, Joab was the fist. The mind of a military genius. Joab was ruthless, brilliant, and absolutely fearless. He led Israel's army to victory after victory. He captured Jerusalem, securing the city that would become the heart of Israel. He outmaneuvered enemy generals time and time again. But his most legendary moment, a battle where he faced 2 armies at once, and won. The battle of 2 fronts. Joab and his brother Abishai were leading Israel's army when they were suddenly surrounded. On one side, the Ammonites on the other. The Arameans, they were trapped. Most generals would panic. Most would surrender. But Joab, he split his forces. He took the best warriors and fought one enemy head-on. His brother Abishai took the rest and engaged the second army. The result? Both enemies crumbled. With precise strategy and fearless execution, Joab turned a no-win situation into a decisive victory. Why was Joab feared? Joab wasn't just a general. He was a warrior with no mercy. If you threatened Israel, you died. If you betrayed David, you died. If you stood in his way, you died. When David's son Absalom rebelled, Joab didn't hesitate. He hunted him down and killed him. He was loyal to David, but he was also dangerous. So dangerous that even David feared him. Lessons from Joab. Joab was feared, but he was also a warning. Loyalty without wisdom is dangerous. He fought for David, but also disobeyed him. Power must be controlled. Joab was brilliant, but his ambition led to his downfall. Strategy wins wars, not just strength. He knew how to use the battlefield to his advantage. In the end, Joab's own ruthlessness caught up to him. He was executed for his past betrayals. He was a legend in war, but he became a victim of his own choices. 4 warriors down, 1 left, and this last one. He didn't just fight battles, he defied the impossible. Let's move to the final warrior. The underdog who terrified nations. 5. Gideon, the underdog who became a nightmare to his enemies. Some warriors are born with strength, some are raised in battle, but Gideon, he was just an ordinary man, no army, no experience, no reputation, and yet he became one of the most feared warriors in the Bible. A reluctant hero, chosen by God. When we first meet Gideon, he isn't standing on a battlefield. He's hiding. The Israelites were being crushed by the Midianites, a massive enemy army that would invade their land, steal their crops, and destroy everything in sight. Gideon was no warrior. He was just a man trying to survive. But then, God called him. An angel appeared and said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Mighty warrior. Gideon didn't feel mighty. He didn't feel brave. He even questioned if God was really with Israel. But God wasn't looking for a perfect warrior. He was looking for a willing one. And Gideon, despite his doubts, said yes. The impossible battle god commanded Gideon to gather an army to fight the Midianites, and Gideon obeyed. He gathered 32,000 men. Still, they were vastly outnumbered. The enemy had 135,000 soldiers, but then God did something unthinkable. He told Gideon to shrink the army from 32,000 to 10,000, then from 10,000 to just 300 men, against an army of 135,000. This wasn't just a battle, this was suicide. But Gideon didn't back down. Because God had a plan. How Gideon became feared. Most warriors fight with swords and shields. Gideon fought with torches, trumpets, and clay jars. In the middle of the night, Gideon and his 300 men surrounded the enemy camp. Then, all at once, they smashed their jars. They blew their trumpets. They shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." The Midianites woke up in terror. Confused and afraid, they started attacking each other, thinking they were surrounded by a massive army. By sunrise, thousands were dead. And the mighty Midianite army. They were running for their lives. A battle that should have been impossible became one of the greatest victories in history. Why was Gideon feared? Gideon wasn't feared because of his own strength. He was feared because God fought for him. He led 300 men against an army of 135,000 and won. His enemies destroyed themselves in panic. He turned from a frightened man into a warrior who changed history. This was more than war. This was a miracle. Lessons from Gideon. God uses the weak to defeat the strong. Gideon wasn't a warrior, but God made him one. Obedience leads to victory. If Gideon had refused to shrink his army, he wouldn't have seen the miracle. Fear doesn't disqualify you. Faith does. Gideon was afraid, but he still obeyed, and that's why he won. Gideon's story proves that it's not about how strong you are. It's about who fights for you. Conclusion. The warriors who shook the world, 5 warriors, 5 different battles. Each of these men faced impossible odds. Each of them should have lost, but they didn't, because they weren't fighting alone. David took down a giant with a single stone. Samson wiped out armies with his bare hands. Joshua stopped the sun and conquered nations. Joab was an unstoppable military mastermind. Gideon defeated 135,000 soldiers with just 300 men. What do these warriors teach us? They weren't the strongest, they weren't the most skilled, but they had something greater. They had faith. Faith to fight when the odds were against them. Faith to obey when it didn't make sense. Faith to trust that God was in control of the battle, and that's what made them unstoppable. Now, it's your turn. The battles you face today may not be on a battlefield. Your giants may not be named Goliath. Your enemies may not carry swords. But the same God who gave them victory is the same God who fights for you. So let me ask you, which warrior inspires you the most? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if this inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful biblical content. Because the battles may change, but the God of victory remains the same. Amen.